Hello and welcome to Heroes and Humans of Football. My name is Mehreen Khan.
And I'm Simon Cooper. This is the football show where we take the hero and we show you the human.
From Johan Cruyff to Megan Rapinoe.
And from George Best to Kylian Mbappe.
This is the Human Football Podcast.
Last week was part 2 of our two-parter on Arsene Wenger, in which we traced the fall of the man who remade English football. Be sure to give it a listen.
Today's episode is on Hakan Şükür, the bull of the Bosphorus, who to this day still holds the record for scoring the fastest goal at a World Cup after only 11 seconds in 2002. He is Turkey's greatest goalscorer and greatest footballer. But now in his 50s, Şükür lives in self-imposed exile on the west coast of the US, where he moonlights as an Uber driver and has been branded a terrorist by Turkey's ruling AK party, a party he was once elected a member of parliament of. This is the story of a 90s cult icon who's become one of the most polarising figures in Turkish sport. He's also slowly being erased from the annals of Turkish footballing history, quite literally, after he fell on the wrong side of the country's president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, a man who actually officiated Şükür's wedding over 20 years ago. Now, Simon, I think this is going to be one of the most spectacular stories of a footballing hero and his downfall that we're going to tell in this podcast. What do you remember of Hakan Şükür?
I remember this motionless striker. When I first saw him, it was in 2000 at the Euro against Belgium. And, you know, it's a very big name. He was Turkey's key player. And so I watched him closely and I thought, this guy is useless. He just stands there, hardly moves all match. You know, the Turks, not a very good team, would kind of hit the balls in his vague direction and he'd kind of hang his head in sorrow at the poor passing. And I thought, why is everyone obsessed with him? And then, having done nothing the whole game, he scored twice.
2 goals, yeah.
Yeah.
It was a very good tournament for him, probably much better than the actual World Cup that he's become known for.
Which was the peak of Turkish football history, because Turkey is this football-mad country that has never been very good at football, except with Şükür at the start of the century.
And they finished third in that tournament in 2002. So I actually remember Şükür as a kid because he was one of those number 9s that, you know, everyone is sort of obsessed with. And he's playing in Turkey, which is a team that I had a natural affiliation to because they were one of the few international teams sort of from Europe and also Muslim majority. So they kind of had my heart. But I'd forgotten about him until the most recent World Cup in Qatar, when I read a story somewhere on my Twitter feed about a Turkish commentator who was sacked on air, so live in a match between halftime. And the reason he was sacked by the Turkish broadcaster, TRT, is because he actually deigned to mention Şükür's name in commentary.
Probably he regretted that immediately.
So he's commentating on Morocco-Canada, so it's not even a Turkish match. And he mentions that Hakan Şükür still holds the record for the fastest goal at a World Cup. And little did he know, he got the chop at halftime. Because even mentioning Şükür's name live on television or in any Turkish footballing context is enough to get you the sack.
Yeah, because everyone nowadays goes around saying they've been cancelled, but Şükür really has been cancelled. You're not allowed to refer to the most significant figure probably in Turkish football history.
And in this episode, we're going to tell the story of how Şükür goes from being a national hero to persona non grata and living as a fugitive away from Turkey for the last 10 years. But before we do that, Simon, you're going to give us some Şükür stats.
Yes, courtesy of Goal Unit. So Şükür played from 1992 to 2007, scored 258 goals in 540 club matches, almost a goal every other game. His best times were at Galatasaray, 108 goals between 1995 and 2000, still the highest scorer in domestic Turkish football and Gala's greatest ever goal scorer. He helped Turkey finish third in the 2002 World Cup, which was actually the first World Cup they played in 48 years. He's still the national team's all-time highest scorer with 51 goals. And his Galatasaray won 4 consecutive titles and also Turkey's first ever European trophy in 2000, winning the UEFA Cup after beating Arsene Wenger's Arsenal on penalties after going down to 10 men. Very dramatic. So, Mehreen, tell us where Hakan Şükür comes from.
So, Şükür is born in 71 in the western part of Turkey, and he is a second-generation immigrant. Both of his parents are of Albanian origin from what was the former Yugoslavia. So his father is a Kosovar from Pristina, and his mother is from Skopje, which today is called North Macedonia. Şükür is Muslim, and his ethnicity, which doesn't really play a huge part in his footballing life, does become one of the sticking points in his political life, particularly when he gets attacked by the hyper-nationalist government of the day.
They start to say he's not really Turkish.
Exactly, and he also starts to lean into the fact that he might not be really Turkish, so we're going to get into that. Şükür started playing professional football at the age of 16 in his hometown club in Sakarya, and he moves to the Super League, the equivalent of the Premier League in Turkey, in 1990 to play for Bursaspor. And even, as a young man, he's prodigious enough and prolific enough, scoring 30 goals in his first 4 seasons, that he gets a spot on the Turkish national team at the age of 19. Now, that's pretty prestigious, but the national team suck, right? At the start of the 90s, the Turkish national team are a chronic disappointment.
In fact, I once met the goalkeeper who had been in goal when they lost 8-0 to England in the late 80s. The goalkeeper told me it was, his finest moment because he says everybody remembers it. So yeah, not a strong team.
By the early 90s, Turkey haven't qualified for a major tournament in the last 3 decades. Şükür's international career, however, does actually coincide with, I think we can still say, the high watermark of Turkish
Definitely the best
football.
period they've ever had, yeah.
They qualified for Euro 96. It was the first time in history that's ever happened, and it was largely because of Şükür's goals in qualifying. And now, actually, even though they're not very good, they will be co-hosting the Euros, bizarrely, in 2032, which is going to be a trans-European exercise with some matches in Turkey and some spread across England and Ireland. But
there we go.
That tells you everything about what the Euros has become. His big break comes in 1992. He moves to Galatasaray, one of the giant Istanbul clubs, one of 3. So we have Galatasaray, Fenerbahce and Besiktas. And his first 2 seasons, Gala win 2 consecutive titles and 2 domestic trophies with Şükür and the squad. So Galatasaray are hugely successful domestically, and they are developing some brilliant players. But nobody outside Turkey, and especially I don't think in England or in the Western European leagues, knows much about Turkish football, what it's about and sort of the vibe of the fans. And all of that changes in this seminal moment, which has now been known as the Welcome to Hell game. This is in the 1993-1994 season when Manchester United, led by Sir Alex Ferguson, get drawn in the Champions League against Galatasaray. Now, the Champions League is weird in the early 90s. It's not like it is now. We have group stages and knockout stages. You have like a series of qualifying stages and then a group stage, which only has 8 teams in it, and then you get to the final. So Fergie's team is stacked with talent. Eric Cantona, Roy Keane, Schmeichel in goal. The first leg's 3-3. Gala get 2 away goals. And then they have to go to Istanbul to see it out. Galatasaray still huge underdogs. And this is a game which is marked by probably one of the most hostile environments that any English football team has ever walked into, unbeknownst to them. And it's called the Welcome to Hell moment because when Manchester United land in Istanbul, they're greeted by hundreds of Galatasaray fans who've broken into the airport and are holding up a banner saying, "Welcome to Hell." There's a brilliant documentary about this entire match and just, I think, how unbeknownst to United that they were going to enter a football stadium and some football fans that they probably never really encountered on some of those exotic trips that you have to do when you're in the Champions League going to, the Nordics or Portugal. Turkey wasn't like that.
Well, I think that United and especially the tabloids with them read us as this very hostile environment, the most hostile environment an English team had ever walked into. And it was, I'm sure, quite hostile. But for Turks, this was just the biggest match in their history. United are coming to play in Istanbul and Galatasaray might actually do it. It's amazing. This country had never done anything in football. And also, I had never been to Istanbul or Turkey at that point. But when I later began to go, what really struck me in Istanbul was just how kind everybody was, how friendly and welcoming. When you met someone, you could hardly get rid of them. They wanted to look after you the whole day.
What did you expect? Welcome to Hell banner?
I didn't expect Welcome to Hell, but it was so far from Welcome to Hell. And I've later come to think that kind of Welcome to Hell rhetoric that the English football teams always have when they go to Turkey. There's a racist element to it.
Definitely, it's the trope of the barbaric Turk. But I think also in the 90s, it's also part of the parochialism of English football that they just don't understand how any other types of football leagues operate. This is the sort of story that we tell with Wenger. And, there are some brilliant anecdotes about Dennis Irwin when he gets to his hotel, his bellboy who, drops off his bag, looks at him straight in the eye and makes a throat-slitting gesture at him. And then he realizes, okay, we might be in a bit of trouble.
Gary Pallister says it made Anfield look like a tea party.
Exactly. The second leg ends 0-0, which is probably for the best because I think if Galatasaray had scored, there probably would have been a pitch invasion. And at full time, there are incredible scenes of Eric Cantona, who's so annoyed about the fact that they've been knocked out and ends up having a punch-up with a policeman who has to drag him off the pitch. Fergie says that he never ever wants to return to Istanbul if he can ever help it. And, I guess these fans really leave their mark on the English psyche, as you said, because from that point onwards, Turkey is a constant welcome to hell reminder. And also the fact that there are fans in the world that take football far more seriously than the English, which they would have been surprised by.
I've never been to a country, I've made many trips to Turkey now, almost always for football. I've never been to a country where football is so constantly discussed.
So, Şükür at this point is a superstar, so much so that when he gets married in 1995, his wedding is broadcast on TV. And in the UK, I guess if you're that famous, you only sell your exclusive wedding rights to Hello magazine. But, this is far more equitable. And the reason this is important is that there is a brilliant, now infamous picture. So in this photo, you have Erdogan, who's then a very promising politician, and Gulen, who's probably the most famous cleric or preacher in Turkey of his day. And these two guys, at this moment in time, are friends. They are in an alliance together, politically and religiously. However, 2 decades later, they're going to fall out spectacularly, and that is going to have incredible reverberations for Şükür's life, and eventually will mean that he is living in the US trying to find work as an Uber driver.
But 95, the 90s are the good days for him, and he's scoring and scoring. Clubs outside Turkey think, hey.
And in the 90s, the best clubs in the world and the best league in the world is Serie A. Juventus call up his agent and are interested in him, but they also have this guy called Thierry Henry, who actually doesn't last very long, and another guy called Zinedine Zidane, who does last quite long on their books. And instead, he ends up going to Torino, the other club in Turin. Now, Şükür does not have a great time. His forays outside of Turkey, as we'll come to know, are spectacularly disastrous. He can only really do it in the Turkish league. He doesn't adapt to life in Torino and leaves after just 5 appearances and 1 goal with the club, and then goes back to Galatasaray in what will become a historic second stint at the club.
At the end of the 90s, Hakan Şükür has become a really significant Turkish player in the national team. He's failed abroad, but at home and with Galatasaray, he's becoming a big shot. He's attracting the attention of political figures, including Erdogan, the future leader of Turkey, and this preacher called Fethullah Gulen. Both these men are going to play very fateful roles in Şükür's life after he achieves full stardom. So how does he go from Turkey's best footballer, which he's becoming at this point, to an Uber driver in the US? Find out after the break.
Are you loving listening to Heroes and Humans every week? Do you hate the wait between our weekly episodes? If so, why not join our official H&H Supporters Club on Patreon? This exclusive community is the place for behind-the-scenes sneak peeks, Q&A opportunities with me and Simon, and more bonus content. The link is in the episode description and on all our social media bios. This is a reminder that you're listening to Heroes and Humans of Football with me, Mehreen Khan.
And me, Simon Cooper.
Later on, we're going to talk about how Hakan Şükür becomes a taxi driver in the US. But 20 years before, he's at the height of his footballing powers in the early 2000s. He is working with legendary coach Fatih Terim at Galatasaray, and they win the UEFA Cup, the first time a Turkish team has ever won a major European trophy. The team they beat is Wenger's Arsenal, who are at that point reigning Premier League champions in Copenhagen. It's a penalty shootout, of course, so an English team loses. They lose pretty badly, actually, 4-1. Vieira misses his penalty. Davos Şükür also misses his penalty. And Simon, you were around the early 2000s, you were also watching this Galatasaray team and Turkish football generally.
We should give Hakan Şükür credit for thumping his penalty top bins past David Seaman. Yeah, I was just then, the start of 2000s, I was writing about football all the time, and I was starting to, like many football journalists, for the first time ever, think, hey, there's a country called Turkey. Never thought about it before in football.
You literally had no idea what Turkey was before then?
They had not hugely impinged on my field of vision.
Your hinterland was quite narrow at that point. It's okay. This podcast is about broadening it out.
Well, I suppose it's a bit like Kazakhstan now. If I asked you about Kazakhstan football today, you might not have strong opinions, but in 2000, that's sort of where Turkey was. Kazakhstan football is lit. What are you on about? I watch it every other... They play on Thursdays. They don't. I just made that up. Yeah, I thought so. Okay, so my first close encounter with this whole world that he comes from is it's the beginning of September 2001. And I go to Istanbul for the first time because in those days, magazines still had money. And this Japanese magazine was sending me around Europe to round up the final qualifiers for the World Cup. So I was in Dublin watching the tragic defeat of Holland to Ireland. And then I fly to Istanbul And not knowing that in 6 days' time, 9/11 is going to happen and the relations between the West and the Islamic world are going to change. Istanbul, I just was entranced by. It was a much smaller city then. It's just grown and grown and grown. I mean, people say it might have 20 million inhabitants now. Everyone was really friendly to me. No welcome to hell business. And I go to the crucial World Cup qualifier, Turkey-Sweden. Turkey's chance to get to their first World Cup since 1954. The stadium, I think it was the Galatasaray stadiums in this smoggy Ali Sami Yen stadium underneath the motorway. It's like the unhealthiest place ever to play football. You know, be healthier just
breathing in smog,
sitting at home having some cigarettes on the sofa. So people are flocking from all over Istanbul, from the European side, from Asia, the bridges between, petrol belching cars and buses, queuing, traffic jams everywhere to get to this stadium. And the guy I've told myself I'm going to watch, because I always feel when you're watching a team you don't know well, you can't really see all 11 players. Mm-hmm. The most you can do is see one or two and see who they are and what they're trying to do. So I've told myself, watch Hakan Şükür. People say he's a good player. And he's the captain and he strides onto the pitch. He kisses his gold chain. He's very striking presence. He's much taller than the other Turks. He has his ramrod straight guardsman's back. He's a very imposing presence. Outside Turkey, the guy had no reputation at all. He was sitting on benches in Italy. But in Turkey, he's every Turk's ideal son-in-law. Babies are named after him. Hakan himself says at that time, a sports writer once said, every mountain can be climbed, but he compared me to the sun, and he said no one could rise above the sun. So I'm watching him very closely. And the first 45 minutes, the guy does nothing. I don't think he touches the ball. It's against Sweden. At one point, he sprints to the bench for water. It's the only activity, the only kind of sign of a pulse. Just after half time, I realize, okay, his tactic is he saves his energy by doing nothing. And so that when the moment comes, when he sees an opening,
he's a boxer.
He's going to be sharper than his marker. Turkey get a counterattack and he begins running like he's just woken up in a burning house, leaves his marker a yard behind him, and he heads in the opening goal. The stadium goes completely mad. And Turkey are 1-0 up. They're going to go to the World Cup. 3 minutes to play, crowds jumping and drumming, underneath the motorway. We're all having a brilliant time. And then Henrik Larsson scores for Sweden. Everyone goes very quiet. For almost 15 seconds, total silence. And then the Turkish journalists sitting around me start arguing about whose fault it was. Game goes on, 3 minutes into extra time. Hakan's still standing motionless, hands on his hips, which is his characteristic pose when he's not scoring goals. And another Swede appears in front of the Turkish keeper, heads home. Sweden going to the World Cup. Then the rest of the game is all silence. Everyone leaves, total silence. But they qualify for World Cup 2002 anyway, which, amazing achievement for Turkey. And so they are heading to Japan and Korea. It's their biggest moment in their history coming.
You've described him as being motionless, but that's kind of what a lot of the best strikers in the 90s were like. They were there to tap the ball in or to make that little run, that little jink, get between two defenders and head a goal in. And he was just really, really good at it.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of other figures of that time, like Michael Owen or Filippo Inzaghi, also they didn't really participate in the game.
He was very much of his time, and subsequently he's now very defensive about the fact that he's got this sort of tap-in merchant, fox in the box reputation, and he's very keen to remind people that actually he scores all types of goals. And I went back through the archives, and there is this brilliant goal. So he basically does nothing in Italy, but he does score for Inter in the Milan derby, which it's kind of worth its weight in gold. And it's a fantastic goal. It's pouring down with rain in the San Siro. He receives a pass on the volley from Clarence Seedorf. He takes it on this diagonal run and he just buries it into the top corner. And he does nothing else of any note in Italian football, but that is still, I think, one of the greatest goals to be scored in that era in a Milan derby. And also his heading ability is brilliant. I know we say that, he doesn't do much, but his heading ability is incredible.
No, he's technically very proficient, but he doesn't like moving.
So they do make it to the World Cup, and this is definitely the moment that Şükür will forever be remembered for. Despite the fact that he had a pretty rubbish tournament, he scores one goal. It's the fastest goal still to have ever been scored in a World Cup in the playoff round against hosts South Korea after 11 seconds. Were you there, Simon?
That was the third place game. No, I saw them against Japan. It was a very moving match because Japan had this young team and they would
also co-hosting.
And Japan were co-hosting. I was in Japan that whole tournament. It's the only month I've ever spent in Japan. It was fantastic. It's pouring rain and Turkey win. Turkey knock out Japan. It's a knockout round. And the crowd is crying. The players are crying. The players are bowing to the crowd and apologizing for losing. It's just very beautiful. And then the Turks come to applaud the crowd and the crowd applauds the Turks. And I thought Japan is the best country in the world. This was just very beautiful. I'm crying now as I'm telling you.
That's because you're far too civilized to enjoy real football. That's okay.
You would not do well in Japan. You'd be considered mouthy.
I've been to Japan. I've been told to shut up in public all the time.
Yeah,
I once got slapped on the knee on the train as well because my foot was facing the wrong direction.
Yeah, probably rightly so.
Yeah.
No, you're not a classic
I'm not
Japanese.
big in Japan.
No. So, and then I saw them, they play Brazil in the semis.
Yes.
And the problem with that World Cup is that Brazil were just 4 times better than anyone else.
Brazil had also beaten England on the route.
Yeah, Brazil beat England with 10 men. They probably would have beaten England with 8 men.
The goal was fluke, that Ronaldinho free kick.
You think Ronaldinho doesn't have the skills to put a ball
I think he does, but I just didn't think he meant it at that particular moment.
Of course he did.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, he totally did. Turkey obviously are going to lose to Brazil, but they finished third, and this may remain forever the zenith of their football history.
And of Şükür's.
And Şükür is
and
part
it's
of
important because it's such an important moment. We are going to talk later on about how there is an effort to systematically erase this guy and any imprint he's left on Turkish football. But when you score the fastest goal at the World Cup ever, it's quite difficult to stop being that singular reference point of being the guy who scored the fastest ever goal at a World Cup. So,
well, it's not the only thing he did. I mean, relative to Turkey's football history, he is the Franz Beckenbauer figure of Turkish football. You can't. It'd be like writing Beckenbauer out of German football. What's left?
And yet.
So after they finished third, Şükür and some other players are said to have donated their World Cup bonuses to the Gulenist movement.
Yes, so we mentioned Gulen a little bit earlier on.
Preacher who runs what some call a cult.
Exactly. And to help explain who Gulen is, what kind of role he's occupied in modern Turkey, and how the Hizmet network, so the name of his movement, how they operate, we're going to speak to John McManus. Now, John is someone that we both know through our colleague Laura Patel, and who you also know because he's a writer about Turkish football.
Yeah, I first met John in Vienna, yes.
John's a Leicester fan and also a Besiktas fan, and has written a brilliant book about his experiences studying sort of the politics and anthropology of Turkish football. It's called Welcome to Hell.
How could it not be?
Exactly. The first moment where John, I think like many other English fans, discovered that Turkish football is a thing. I start by asking John, what is the Hizmet movement and who is Gulen?
Let's run the clip.
This movement has many names. Hizmet is often the one that people within it use, and it's basically people who are followers of a preacher called Fethullah Gulen. Those outside the movement are more inclined to call them Gülenists or members of the Gulen movement. And if you're in Turkey nowadays, they're referred to as FETÖ, which is the Fethullah Gulen Terror Örgütü, or the Fethullah Gulen Terrorist Organization. So you can see through those changing definitions, in a way, the movement of the group in terms of Turkey today, where they've gone from being people very close to the AK party and Erdogan to receiving the ultimate epithet of outsiderism to be called a terrorist, right? Which is used very commonly in Turkey to paint people as enemy number one.
In terms of the membership of Hizmet, is it strange for a footballer or somebody that is not religiously affiliated to be a member of Hizmet in the way that Şükür is?
I think it's not strange for footballers to be religious, right? Think of links between footballers and evangelical churches in Brazil. And the way that the Gulen movement worked, they had a very kind of distinctive recruitment strategy, which was often they would get, like a young student to find promising high school students or early university students and organize study sessions where they get them together and they would help them study for exams. And then slowly they'd introduce them to the ideas of the movement. What happens is that it seems that they had one of these groups with footballers from Galatasaray. And this kind of came out post 2016 following the failed coup attempt in Turkey, which the Gulen movement is associated with. There are famous footballers from the same side that Hakan Şükür was part of. For instance, the left back, Hakan Ünsal, he gave this confession on television that basically spoke about how he was recruited by an older player, how he met Gulen personally. And then there was another interview by this man called Said Alpsoy, who called himself the football imam and claimed to be the biggest recruiter in football in the late 90s and early 2000s. And he said that they were recruited to be used as vehicles for advertising the movement. If all things surrounding the Gulen movement, it's very hard to actually have hard evidence. It's very much like hearsay against hearsay. But yeah, I think it's very plausible that footballers were being leveraged to show the group's reach, get players to meet with prominent businessmen, get them to donate to the movement. And of course, some players, I think Şükür included, very much believed in what they were theologically, what they were getting involved in.
So we don't precisely know how Hakan Şükür becomes a member of Hizmet, but it's probably quite likely that he does interact with them while at Galatasaray, given that there's already a Hizmet presence at the club.
Yeah, I think that's correct. This secrecy is a really big part of this, how this group grew and evolved. You know, for instance, there were members of Gulen in the armed forces who were reported to drink alcohol in order to hide the fact that they were religious. So there's very much a kind of discourse and an approach of not necessarily revealing that you are part of the movement, which is also makes it quite hard to understand what their exact aims were and who exactly was involved and to what degree.
I'm going to say that the Gulen-Erdogan relationship is a bit like that Spider-Man meme when they're both looking at each other and realise that they're the same guy.
Well, that was fascinating. I was the one who said we should get John on. I feel much educated, but one thing slightly puzzles me. You were saying that it's like Spider-Man. Can you just run this by me again?
So it's the Spider-Man meme. Do I have to explain what a meme is, or are we good?
Meme I get, Spider-Man I'm a bit puzzled by. I mean, I hate to sound like somebody who's out of touch with popular culture.
Dude, no. Well, that's what I'm here for.
Yeah.
The Spider-Man meme is a still taken from the brilliant Spider-Man cartoons. Please tell me you've watched the Spider-Man cartoons.
Yes, but nearly 50 years ago.
What, in black or white or something?
I can't remember.
Where there's all the Spider-Mans are there and they're all pointing and looking at each other and they realise they're all Spider-Man. So Gulen and Erdogan, who think that they are mortal enemies, actually, they're both
the same.
Yeah, pointing at each other in the same direction.
You mean megalomaniac figures who want everyone to follow them?
And who want to run Turkey secretly or overtly.
Right.
So Şükür is part of the Hizmet movement. It's not something that he's advertising, as John has already mentioned. It's not something that members do advertise. So I guess it's also a bit like Fight Club.
He does say something on TV. He says that he's an
In the early
admirer
2000s, he does admit that he's an admirer of Gulen, but that's as much as he'll ever really go in public while he's still playing football. Because, of course, when you're playing for Galatasaray and Turkey, on one part, you're a really polarizing figure. You're playing for Galatasaray. That means Fenerbahce and Beşiktaş fans don't like you. But you're also a Turkish national hero. So a few months every other summer, you know, people do also love you and hold you up as one of their own. And he becomes a bit of a Turkish footballing export. Not that he does particularly well as
He's
an
a
export.
bad export, yeah.
He's not like, I guess, kebabs and Turkish delight. It doesn't work out as well.
No, although some say the kebab is invented in Berlin. But
These are white people taking the credit for everything. Anyway, so he's at Inter. He does score that brilliant goal, but he doesn't really do much. Spends a couple of seasons at Parma and then actually ends up in Blackburn. I do actually remember this weird season at Blackburn.
You may be the only person who remembers him at Blackburn.
Do you don't remember him at Blackburn? When he came to the Premier League, I was quite excited. He's managed by Graham Souness, but it's a very injury-blighted season. He doesn't really play much. They don't extend his contract after a year.
So in 3 years in Italy and England, he scores a combined total of 9 goals.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he goes home.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons this happens is that by the mid-2000s, football is changing and the role of that number 9, that striker, is also changing. So you mentioned Owen, we mentioned Inzaghi, I put Shevchenko in that kind of mould of the fox in the box or the 5 to 10 yard striker. And eventually, by the end of the decade, to be a forward in modern football, you have
to be able to play with the team. You have to participate fully. There's no more specialists. The specialists are dying out. And Pep Guardiola, everyone will have listened to our podcast about him, of course, and if not, do it now. Guardiola sort of abolishes the number 9, plays without one.
And I'm thinking of players like Van Persie, Wayne Rooney and Samuel Eto'o at this point, who become one of the best strikers of their generations, and they are very much comfortable scoring from 30 yards and scissor kicks and overhead kicks than they are 3. I don't think Şükür could have done an overhead kick to save his life, bless him.
So anyway, he's done in 2008. Retires.
And in 2011, he makes a switch to politics and becomes a member of parliament for Turkey's then and still ruling AKP party, which is the party of Erdogan.
Which annoys a lot of Turks who like football but do not like the AKP.
Yes.
So he's kind of selling himself to the leader.
They're a sort of conservative, people call them an Islamist movement. But I guess for Şükür, who is, religious and devout and also Gülenist, which means that he's in cahoots with Erdogan, it's not a, surprising move.
Yeah, he's a very religious figure. I mean, he's teetotal, which by no means all Turks are. And it's said, I was told that in the national team, he would lead the prayers. So in the Turkish team, it's very normal for them to pray together. When they travel, they will go and find a mosque. So it's quite a religious team, and he leads that part of team life.
So when Şükür talks about how he got into politics, he says that he was a very reluctant participant and politician. And actually, his fame, his stature, his wealth was hijacked by the government and used as a way to promote Turkey abroad. Having said that, I think those comments with the benefit of hindsight would suggest that Şükür didn't want to get into politics, but he's already a member of Hizmet. And as we already know, Hizmet is a movement that has political ambitions. They have very powerful people installed in different parts of the Turkish state, in the military and in the army. So it's not that strange for someone like Şükür to go into politics.
And Erdogan is all over him and the people who are ruling Turkey because, he's this extremely popular, the greatest player in Turkish history. So he also becomes a big football commentator on state-owned TRT TV. So he's almost the Gary Lineker of Turkish football as well. So he's raking in money even after retiring.
Yeah, he's a hugely popular figure. At that point, it's clear that he is the GOAT of Turkish football. And so he's got a lot of exposure. And if you're a politician, that's a brilliant thing to ride off his coattails.
He's very obliging to politicians at this point. But his relations with Erdogan are going to go horribly wrong. Soon he's speaking out on social media against the leader. And eventually his break with Erdogan is going to lead to him losing everything he owns, losing his relationship with his parents, and even losing his place in Turkish football because he gets written out of the story. Şükür's legacy, and in fact any trace of his presence in Turkish football, is being actively erased. Remember the commentator at the World Cup 2022 who mentions his name and then is replaced at half-time. Şükür has become a non-person in Turkey. He's one of the few people who genuinely has been cancelled.
He's Lord Voldemort.
Although Voldemort remains a powerful presence, whereas Şükür has become an Uber driver.
Inside the country, he is, as you said, a non-person.
So let's look at this non-person, how that happens, and how the non-person is living.
His career as a politician is perhaps almost as disastrous as his attempts to be a striker in Serie A. And the main issue is that he has multiple identities. He's a sporting icon. He's idolised in the country and by one particular group of fans. He's also a politician in the ruling party, and then he's a committed member of the Gulenist movement. And in 2013, Erdogan and Gulen's relationship breaks down in spectacular fashion. And Şükür can't reconcile the sort of three parts of his identities, and the loyalty he ultimately chooses is to stick with Gulen. So Şükür goes on his Twitter account, he starts sending tweets which are very critical of Erdogan because Erdogan wants to shut down some Gulen schools. He resigns as an MP for the ruling party and stands as an independent. In a really sort of sensitive political environment in Turkey, Şükür, former national hero, is charged with insulting the president with his tweets. And this is a crime that could lead to up to 4 years in prison. And hundreds of people in Turkey in 2013 are being prosecuted for this very crime. And very, very quickly, the witch hunt against Şükür gains pace. In 2011, there's a local stadium named after him in the area where he's born. It's very quickly renamed. Şükür seems to be pretty defiant at this point, and he tells local media that he'd rather have his voice heard in the world than a portrait of his hung on a wall. So he's kind of developing his freedom fighter instincts, and he's somebody who wants to stand up to what he thinks is the injustices of the governing party.
So he's gone from being at the heart of the Erdogan regime to a dissident against the Erdogan regime.
And he's still in the country at this time. There is a controversial moment where he's speaking to some university students about his footballing career, and he makes a comment where he talks about his ethnicity, and he describes himself as Albanian. In a country where he's already being seen by some parts of Turkey as a traitor, this comment becomes a real lightning rod for all of the nationalists who say that Şükür is actually denouncing his Turkishness.
Maybe he should have played for Albania.
It was kind of funny because the guy literally did nothing outside of Turkey. So if he did switch him somehow and get Albanian nationality, he probably would have been rubbish. I mean, Şükür's career is rooted in Turkey. It's the only place that he's really thrived as a footballer.
It's the only place where he has fans.
Well, no, I think he has fans everywhere.
And Turkish fans.
Nah. If you played FIFA in the 90s and you watched Italian football, you know Şükür.
Okay, I did not play FIFA in the 90s. I did watch Italian football. Nobody noticed Şükür there. But, okay, he's really made by Turkey. He's made in Turkey. He's made by Turkey. He's beloved in Turkey at that time.
Şükür is quintessentially a product of Turkish football. And I think that's why, the charges of him being a traitor or not really being Turkish just sort of sum up just how difficult his life in Turkey becomes at this point.
Life in Turkey is becoming very hot for anyone who's seen as a dissident. Erdogan is cracking down on dissidents. He's arresting politicians, journalists, hundreds of members of the Gulenist movement. And some people peel off the Gulenist movement. They say, oh, well, I was never really part of it. So other football people who were Gulenists, like Okan Buruk. They beg for Erdogan's mercy and they keep their positions in Turkish football. But Şükür says no. He says, I'm with Gulen. He comes out, as it were, as a Gulenist.
And one of the ways he does that, he kind of votes with his feet. He leaves Turkey in 2015 as the political environment is becoming much more hostile, and he ends up in the US. I don't think he would know this, but he would never return to Turkey after 2015. Şükür is tried in absentia, which means he's not present in the court and he's not party to the court proceedings while he's still in the US. That trial never actually comes to a conclusion because something much more significant happens in 2016 when there is an attempted coup against the Erdogan regime. And that's really when Turkish politics explodes.
Yeah, there's violence in the centre of Istanbul, 300 people killed, tanks on the streets. The coup fails. And Erdogan says, well, the person behind the coup is Gulen, this preacher that Şükür is a follower of. And Gulen, at this point, he's living in Pennsylvania. He's getting diabetes injections. He says, no, I have nothing to do with the coup.
This is the moment where Erdogan, who is a politician known for his paranoia, and it's justified because there are always threats to his rule. And then when a coup actually happens and there are tanks on the streets, all of this guy's paranoia seems to be justified.
You see, they're really out to get me.
This is 40 years of crying wolf and suddenly it happens.
Yeah.
And the reaction, the counter-reaction to the potential coup is brutal. And Şükür is one of the victims. So there very quickly is an arrest warrant over his head. His assets are frozen. His father, who ends up getting diagnosed with cancer, is put in jail. His wife, who runs a small business, is attacked.
I think his children are abused on the street.
And the government say that Hizmet, or the Gulen movement, is a terrorist organization. Stories have emerged about the extent to which Erdogan has tried to get Şükür back to the country, and he even opened diplomatic talks with then Donald Trump after 2016 to get Şükür as part of a prisoner swap for a Republican pastor who's been locked up in Turkey for a few years. That's the sort of level and degree to which Şükür is a scalp for Erdogan to show people that when you're a member of this movement, you will be brought down and punished.
Life has got really desperate for Şükür. He's living in the US, country not his own, and he tells a German newspaper, I have nothing left. Erdogan took everything. My right to liberty, my freedom of expression, my right to work. Nobody seems able to explain what my role in this coup was supposed to be. I never did anything illegal. I am not a traitor or a terrorist. But he's in this really desperate situation. I mean, he's away from home and he's lost everything at home. His properties have been taken away. He had tens of millions of dollars worth of properties in Turkey. Now he has nothing.
And as we know, every time Şükür left Turkey in his career, things didn't go very well for him. So he's very, very rooted in the country. But while he's out in the US, basically living in exile, the Turks are also doing something else, which is a systematic erasure of any mention or photo or record of Şükür from Turkish football. His photos and names are wiped from the official museum of Galatasaray, the club, and the Turkish national team. There's no mentions of him on any of their social media channels. You can only find cached versions of the club website where there are old references to Şükür, which have since been deleted. There's street naming projects in Turkey after footballers. He's taken off those. And ultimately, if you're in Turkey today, you won't find his face or name on any official club literature. And of course, as we've already said, if you're a commentator, you dare not even speak his name.
I mean, the most bizarre story I heard is that the Turkish Football Federation, obviously they have giant pictures of the 2002 World Cup team because that's the zenith of Turkish football. But Şükür has been photoshopped out of those pictures. So, yeah, he doesn't exist anymore. The same actually has happened to Arif Erdem, who played up front with Şükür for Galatasaray in Turkey.
And one of the, I think, more egregious ones is a documentary film about his legendary manager, Fatih Terim, which you can watch on Netflix.
The Imperator, the Emperor, they call him.
Exactly. And this was a big documentary. So it's a 4-part series on Netflix, which is all about Terim's career. And there is not one mention of the fact that one of the greatest strikers of his generation was playing in those Galatasaray teams. This obviously caused a bit of a furore. Netflix were very much put under criticism for the fact that they bowed to this sort of demand from the Turkish Football Federation because they wanted to use so much of their coverage. But if you watch the Fatih Terim documentary, there is no mention of Şükür.
So he's in the US while all this is going on. What's he doing? How is he coping?
Before he moves to the West Coast, Şükür says that he was on the East Coast around the Washington, D.C. area where he was working as a bookseller and driving an Uber just as a way to get some money in the US before he could bring his family over. He finds a business partner and sets up a cafe selling Turkish breakfasts and pastries in Palo Alto in California.
Where I used to live. My old hometown. Yeah, my dad was attached to the university for a year there. 1980, 81. I played soccer in Palo Alto. Lovely place. Sun always shines. In those days,
you and Hakan Şükür had played football in the same place.
Probably, yeah. There were lovely fields under the redwoods near Stanford University, and no Americans were not very good at football at the time, so it was brilliant. I was this superstar figure for the only time in my life.
And were the tech bros there at this point?
No, there weren't really much. I mean, Palo Alto, Hewlett Packard had been founded in a garage there, but in the early 80s, it wasn't a particularly wealthy town. I mean, it wasn't this kind of billionaire paradise like it is now. And so we lived in a house in the middle of Palo Alto, on this pretty suburban street, which now, of course, you'd have to be Steve Jobs to afford.
Yeah, so Şükür sees that this place is on the up. It's probably already gentrified by the time he's there.
Gentrified? No, I mean, it's gone way past gentrification. It's billionaireized, I'd say.
A billionaire's playground. But he sets up a little cafe, and I read the reviews for it, and they were absolutely glowing.
Yeah, he's a good cafe owner.
No one knew that the guy serving them coffee or pastries was a legendary Turkish footballer. But one food blogger called it a bucket list place to visit if you're in the region.
Wow.
But it doesn't last long. He has to shut the cafe
because there are some people who do know that the guy behind the counter is Hakan Şükür.
And he starts getting some strange visits. So I think it shuts down only a couple of years ago, just after the pandemic.
So he says he was getting strange visitors to the cafe. So some people knew who Hakan Şükür, the guy behind the counter, is. And he said the strange people played dombra music, which is what Erdogan's party has called the true music of Turkey. So it's music associated with Turkish nationalism. And so they were obviously, saying to him, we know who you are, you should be very afraid of us.
Intimidating him, yeah.
Intimidating him. And for a while, he says he's under US police protection and the FBI is keeping an eye out for him because there's a worry that I suppose Erdogan's people are going to try and assassinate him.
I guess the worry for him might be that if Trump returns to the presidency and Trump and Erdogan have a romance between themselves, that the attempts to do a prisoner swap may also be revived.
So Trump sends Şükür back to Turkey where he's then thrown into jail like so many thousands of people are.
Exactly. And I think he's a little bit more secure because since 2020 he managed to get his green card, which could give him a bit more security. But the truth is, if Erdogan wants to go after Şükür, he's going to go after Şükür.
And there's this very terrifying story which may be a premonition of that, which is Şükür says he got to know this Turkish schoolboy in the US and they took a selfie together, of course. And when the boy goes back to Turkey, the photo is discovered on his phone. And according to Şükür, the boy is jailed for 14 months just for having a selfie with Şükür on his phone.
So there are constant reminders in Şükür's life about how much he's still a villainous figure in Turkey for the government.
And potentially in danger still.
And for his wife and his still young children. So he shuts the cafe. He's tried to find an avenue in coaching. So he set up I think quite a modest academy. One of the last mentions I can see of any public appearances he's done was at his local mosque in Ramadan, which is a small gathering. I imagine there'd be probably half a dozen people there to listen to him speak about football. So he's keeping a pretty low profile. And I think that's prudent given the fact that his security in the US is still not guaranteed.
So even though he has very good reasons to be afraid, and clearly Erdogan's minions are sending him threats, I'm impressed by how unbowed he is. He's still out there being a dissident. He's still criticizing Erdogan, even though Erdogan just won a new presidential term last year and could be Turkish leader forever. Şükür has this YouTube channel. He has 800,000 followers on Twitter, and he's still often talking about Turkey's loss of freedom. He's laying into Erdogan, talking about how he loves the country. Also, people who follow him on YouTube want to get him talking about football, very Turkish thing. And so they get him to attack the federation's rotten system of match fixing. And he's very outspoken even against fellow footballers, which is sort of breaking one of the codes of the football profession. So you remember that picture of the German Turks, Mesut Özil and İlkay Gündoğan a few years ago posing with Erdogan? Which was very controversial in Germany too. And Şükür said, I don't think that photo is great. They should honor the country they play for, meaning Germany, because these are guys born and raised in Germany. He is still, despite everything, despite being a penniless dissident whose properties have all been taken away from him, despite the peril, he's still out there speaking.
Yeah, his social media presence is sort of a mix of post-match commentary. So he's talking about the last match in Turkish Premier League, mixed with some caustic political commentary and often some guests. And he uses particularly the YouTube platform as a way to bring on other dissidents, other people who have been so-called victims of the Erdogan regime. One of them is Enes Kanter, an NBA player who's also of Turkish origin, probably Turkey's best ever basketball player, who is far more outspoken than Şükür about his affiliations with Gulen and why he thinks Turkey is going down a wrong path.
Kanter has a $500,000 bounty on his head. How does that work?
So the Turkish government, or some affiliated parts of the Turkish government have put a bounty on his head. So if you can bring this guy's head, quite literally perhaps, to Turkey, you win $500,000, because he has such a, I think, a captive audience in the US, particularly for American broadcasters, for anyone who ever wants to criticize the Erdogan regime. Enes Kanter is always there holding up his hand and volunteering. And I thought the choice of having him on his channel also showed a pretty major degree of defiance, because that's not going to win him any friends back home. So this is a story of, I think, the explosive collision of the most divisive elements of life in modern Turkey: politics, football, and religion to some degree. And, I know Galatasaray supporters, fervent Galatasaray supporters, who are no fans of Erdogan, but also are no fans of Şükür, who think he made a historic mistake in associating himself with Gulen and kept associating himself with Gulen. And I think that's why, ultimately, it'll be pretty hard for Şükür to go back to Turkey. Even if Erdogan is deposed in an election in the next 4 or 5 years, I don't think Turkey is going to be a hospitable place for people associated with Gulen, because this is a movement which is seen as being the power behind the power.
Very secretive movement.
And when they did have the power, they also abused it against their political enemies. And I think perhaps if Turkey becomes a more quote-unquote liberal democratic society, I think rooting out remnants of Gulenism and Erdogan are probably two sides of the same coin.
So there may be no way back for Şükür, although one hopes that he at least will get his picture back in Turkish football.
Exactly.
So what would he have been if he hadn't been a footballer?
If he wasn't a footballer, he may still very well been a member of the Gulen movement, which means that he could have been in politics, in the judiciary, and in the higher echelons of Turkish politics and Turkish society. I don't think he's got enough in him to be a very successful politician, and there are others that we're going to talk about in this podcast, like George Weah, who end up
presidents of the country,
president of their countries. Yeah. But I would see him. I think he would have been a pretty good minister for sport if things had gone right between Erdogan and Gulen, which is very much the path that he was going on before all of this went horribly wrong.
He was an ambitious politician to some degree who got sidelined. Yeah. Would you like to hang out with him?
Yeah, definitely.
Even now the cafe's gone.
The cafe looked fire, to be honest. It looked great.
I would have loved that as well. Just going back to Palo Alto, eating probably $20 little Turkish rolls.
Playing footy with Hakan Şükür. He's probably got amazing stories to tell. I would also really want to ask him whether he regrets anything that's happened over the last decade or so, and if he would have done anything differently. It's been a pretty sad end, and I don't see it right now getting much better for him. But what about you? Palo Alto, right? So no brainer.
Yeah, I'd love to go to Palo Alto, tomorrow, and it's a golden place for me.
Quite literally.
Yeah, I just always see it in sun and those huge redwood trees, and I had this bike and I'd tool around the streets, and I'd go back to school in the evenings and I'd kick a ball around at school in the playground, and it was just...
In another world, Hakan Şükür could have been like your little league coach in Palo Alto.
In another world, I would have been in that cafe every morning, and I would be the only person who'd be able to talk European football with him, and yeah. You were the one who said we should do a Hakan Şükür episode, because I had no idea what had happened to him after football, but I'm really actually moved that we've done it, because here's somebody who was written out of history, whose name was being erased, the most important footballer his country's ever produced. And I like to feel that by talking about him for an hour here, we've done a little something to recover his memory, to uncancel him, to honour him.
I guess this episode will stay on the historical record, unless somebody wants to come and cancel us.
Thank you for listening to Heroes and Humans of Football. For more information, go to our website at heroesandhumans.com.
And follow us at Heroes and Humans on all social platforms.
Next week's episode is on Jurgen Klopp, the People's Manager. Be sure to check it out.
This show was developed by Immaterial and produced by One Fine Play. Matt Cheney is the series producer. Kazra Firuzia is the editor and producer. We have been your hosts, Mehreen Khan
and Simon Cooper.
And this has been Heroes and Humans of Football.